Captain Rebecca Martinez had been flying commercial jets for 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for the chaos that erupted at 35,000 feet over the Nevada desert. What started as a routine red-eye flight from Los Angeles to Chicago became the most terrifying and ultimately redemptive experience of her career. The radio crackled with an urgent transmission that would change everything, and as she looked out her cockpit window, her blood ran cold. 4 F-16 fighter jets had materialized from the darkness, their sleek forms cutting through the night sky like predators closing in on their prey. The trouble had begun 3 hours earlier when Rebecca reported for duty at LAX. Flight 447 was supposed to be a straightforward overnight run with 180 passengers, most of whom were business travelers hopping to catch some sleep before landing in the Windy City. Rebecca had flown this route dozens of times, and her co-pilot, First Officer Daniel Thompson, was equally experienced. They completed their pre-flight checks with military precision, a habit Rebecca had maintained since her days as an Air Force pilot nearly 2 decades ago. The first sign something was wrong came during the security briefing. TSA agent Marcus Williams, a man Rebecca had come to know over the years, seemed unusually tense. His normally friendly demeanor was replaced by clipped, professional responses. When Rebecca asked about the heightened security measures she'd noticed, Marcus simply shook his head and muttered something about elevated threat levels. The vague response left her uneasy, but she pushed the feeling aside. Commercial aviation was filled with protocols and procedures that often seemed excessive to outsiders, but Rebecca understood their necessity. As they taxied to the runway, Rebecca noticed several unmarked vehicles positioned around the tarmac. Federal agents in dark suits stood near the gate, their eyes scanning the boarding passengers with intense scrutiny. She'd seen increased security before, especially after major incidents, but this felt different, more urgent, more personal. The passengers seemed oblivious to the tension, chatting casually as they settled into their seats and prepared for the 5-hour journey ahead. Takeoff proceeded normally, and Rebecca allowed herself to relax as they climbed through the clouds into the star-filled sky. The first 2 hours passed without incident. Passengers dozed in their seats, flight attendants moved quietly through the cabin, and the steady hum of the engines provided a comforting backdrop to the night. Daniel handled the routine communications with air traffic control, while Rebecca monitored the instruments, her trained eye catching the subtle changes in altitude, speed, and heading that marked a smooth flight. It was just past midnight when everything changed. The radio erupted with a priority transmission from NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. The voice was calm but urgent, delivering news that sent ice through Rebecca's veins. A suspected terrorist cell had been tracked to the West Coast, and intelligence suggested they might have infiltrated a commercial flight. Multiple aircraft were being investigated, and Flight 447 was now considered a potential threat to national security. Rebecca's military training kicked in immediately. She'd spent 8 years as an Air Force pilot before transitioning to commercial aviation, flying everything from transport planes to reconnaissance aircraft. The discipline and quick thinking that had served her well in the cockpit of an F-16 now became her lifeline in the face of this unprecedented crisis. The NORAD controller's next words confirmed her worst fears. 4 F-16 Fighting Falcons were being scrambled to intercept Flight 447. They would take up positions around the aircraft and escort it to a secure military airfield for investigation. The passengers were not to be informed of the situation to prevent panic, but Rebecca knew that keeping 180 people calm while surrounded by fighter jets would be nearly impossible. She could already see the distant lights of the approaching aircraft, growing larger by the second. Daniel's face had gone pale as he processed the implications. In the post-9/11 world, they both understood what an intercept meant. If the military deemed their aircraft a threat, the F-16s had authorization to use deadly force. The weight of responsibility for every soul aboard Flight 447 settled heavily on Rebecca's shoulders. She had to find a way to prove their innocence and save her passengers. But with armed fighters closing in and her radio communications now being monitored by military personnel, her options were rapidly diminishing. The lead F-16 pilot's voice crackled through the radio, professional but unmistakably threatening. Commercial Flight 447, this is Viper 1. You are ordered to maintain current heading and altitude. Do not deviate from your flight path. We are authorized to use force if you fail to comply. Rebecca acknowledged the transmission, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She had been in dangerous situations before, but never with so many innocent lives hanging in the balance. As the fighter jets took up their positions around the commercial airliner, Rebecca caught a glimpse of the lead pilot's aircraft through her side window. The F-16 was close enough that she could make out details of the cockpit and the pilot's helmet. Something about the aircraft's configuration seemed familiar, triggering a memory from her military days. She strained to get a better look, hopping against hope that she might recognize something or someone that could help resolve this nightmare. The passengers were beginning to stir, some of them noticing the unusual lights outside their windows. Rebecca knew it was only a matter of time before someone realized they were being escorted by military aircraft. She had to act fast to prevent panic while simultaneously trying to convince the F-16 pilots that Flight 447 posed no threat. Her mind raced through possibilities, searching for anything that might help establish her credibility with the military pilots now holding their lives in their hands. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a former Air Force pilot with an exemplary service record, being treated as a potential terrorist by the very service she had once proudly served. But she also understood the pilot's position. They were following orders, protecting their country from a perceived threat. In their shoes, she would have done the same thing. The challenge now was finding a way to bridge the gap between suspicion and trust before the situation escalated beyond the point of no return. Rebecca's training had taught her that in crisis situations, clear communication and decisive action were essential. She began formulating a plan that would require every ounce of her skill, experience, and courage. The next few minutes would determine whether Flight 447 would land safely or become another tragedy in the ongoing war against terrorism. With F-16s surrounding her aircraft and 180 lives depending on her decisions, Captain Rebecca Martinez prepared to face the greatest challenge of her career. The night sky around them had become a deadly chess game, with Rebecca holding the most important pieces. She took a deep breath, keyed her microphone, and prepared to make the most important radio transmission of her life. Everything she had learned in the military, every flight hour she had logged, every crisis she had weathered had led to this moment. The stakes couldn't be higher, but Rebecca Martinez had never backed down from a challenge, and she wasn't about to start now. Lieutenant Colonel Jake Harrison sat in the cockpit of his F-16, his eyes fixed on the commercial airliner flying steadily ahead of him. 22 years of military service had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, something about this intercept felt different. The Boeing 737 maintained perfect formation, its pilots following every instruction without hesitation. In his experience, guilty parties rarely displayed such professional compliance when faced with armed fighter aircraft. The intelligence briefing had been rushed, filled with vague threats and suspicious activities that pointed to a possible hijacking or worse. But as Jake studied the airliner's behavior, he began to question whether they were chasing the right target. The aircraft's radio communications had been professional and calm, lacking the desperation or deception he'd come to associate with genuine threats. Still, orders were orders, and the potential consequences of being wrong were too catastrophic to ignore. Jake's squadron had been scrambled from Nellis Air Force Base with minimal information. Terrorist chatter had increased dramatically over the past 48 hours, and multiple intelligence agencies had detected suspicious activity around several major airports. Flight 447 had been flagged after a last-minute passenger manifest change and some unusual cargo documentation. The details were classified above Jake's clearance level, but the urgency of the mission spoke volumes about the perceived threat. As he maintained his position off the airliner's starboard wing, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. The commercial pilot's voice had carried a familiar cadence, a precision that reminded him of military training. It was subtle, but after 2 decades of flying with Air Force pilots, he recognized the distinctive communication style that came from years of military discipline and protocol. The intercept had been textbook perfect so far. Jake's wingman, Captain Sarah Chen, maintained position off the port wing while 2 additional F-16s covered the aircraft from above and below. They had established a secure perimeter around Flight 447, ready to respond to any hostile action. The passengers appeared unaware of their predicament, though Jake knew that wouldn't last much longer. Someone would eventually notice the fighter escorts and panic would inevitably follow. Rebecca's voice crackled through the radio again, requesting permission to brief her passengers about minor turbulence ahead. It was a clever move, Jake realized, giving her an excuse to prepare the cabin for potential emergency procedures without revealing the true nature of their situation. He admired her quick thinking and professional demeanor under pressure. Whatever else might be happening aboard Flight 447, the pilots were clearly skilled professionals doing their best to manage an impossible situation. The NORAD controller's voice interrupted Jake's thoughts, providing updated intelligence about the suspected threat. New information suggested the terrorists might have smuggled weapons or explosives aboard the aircraft, though the specifics remained unclear. Jake's finger moved unconsciously toward his weapon systems, a gesture born from years of training and combat experience. If Flight 447 was indeed compromised, he would do whatever was necessary to protect innocent lives on the ground. But doubt continued to gnaw at him. Something about the situation didn't fit the profile of a typical terrorist operation. The aircraft's crew was too cooperative, too professional. Real hijackers would have demanded course changes, made threats, or attempted to communicate with ground control. Instead, Flight 447 continued following its original flight path with mechanical precision, as if nothing had changed except for the addition of 4 armed escorts. Jake's radio crackled with a transmission from the commercial pilot, requesting permission to adjust altitude due to incoming weather. The request was routine, the kind of minor course correction that happened dozens of times during any cross-country flight. But something in the pilot's voice caught his attention. There was a familiarity to the cadence, a precision that triggered memories from his earlier years in the service. He strained to place the voice, running through mental files of pilots he'd served with over the years. The speech patterns were distinctly military, lacking the casual inflections typical of civilian aviators. This pilot had been trained by the Air Force. Jake was certain of it. The question was whether that training made them more dangerous or more trustworthy. In his experience, former military pilots rarely turned against their country, but the intelligence reports suggested otherwise. The weather ahead was indeed deteriorating, with a line of thunderstorms stretching across their intended flight path. Jake could see the lightning flickering in the distance, illuminating towering cumulus clouds that would make flying hazardous for any aircraft. The commercial pilot's request to adjust altitude was not only reasonable but necessary for the safety of everyone aboard. Jake relayed the request to NORAD Control, recommending approval. As Flight 447 began its gradual climb to avoid the storm system, Jake caught a glimpse of the cockpit through his aircraft's advanced optics. The pilot's helmet was briefly visible, and something about the silhouette seemed familiar. He adjusted his position slightly, trying to get a better view while maintaining the required formation distance. Military regulations were strict about intercept procedures, but Jake's curiosity was getting the better of him. The lead pilot's voice came through the radio again, this time with a slight change in tone. "Viper 1, this is Flight 447. I want you to know that we have 180 souls on board, including 12 unaccompanied minors. We are fully cooperating with your instructions and pose no threat to anyone. We just want to get these people home safely." The transmission was brief but loaded with meaning, a subtle reminder that innocent lives hung in the balance. Jake found himself impressed by the pilot's approach. Rather than protesting innocence or demanding explanations, they were focusing on the human cost of any potential mistakes. It was exactly the kind of response he would expect from a fellow military officer, someone who understood both the gravity of the situation and the weight of command responsibility. The doubt that had been building in his mind grew stronger. The storm system was getting closer, and Jake could see the first wisps of turbulence beginning to affect Flight 447. The commercial aircraft was handling the conditions well, with smooth adjustments that spoke to the pilot's skill and experience. Jake had flown in similar weather conditions many times, and he knew how challenging it could be to maintain stable flight while surrounded by armed escorts. The fact that Flight 447's crew was managing the situation so professionally only added to his growing suspicions about the intelligence they'd received. Captain Sarah Chen's voice crackled through the formation's internal communications. "Lead, are you seeing what I'm seeing? This doesn't feel like a hostile intercept. These pilots are too good, too cooperative. Something's not adding up." Jake was relieved to hear that his wingman shared his concerns. Sarah had excellent instincts and 8 years of combat experience. If she was questioning the mission, there was probably good reason. The NORAD controller's voice cut through their conversation with new instructions. Flight 447 was to be diverted to Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, where specialized teams would conduct a thorough investigation. The passengers would be detained for questioning, and the aircraft would be searched for weapons or explosives. Jake acknowledged the orders, but his unease continued to grow. Diverting a commercial flight to a military installation was an extreme measure, typically reserved for the most serious threats. As they adjusted course toward Montana, Jake found himself studying the commercial pilot's technique more closely. The way Flight 447 responded to course corrections, the precision of their radio communications, the professional handling of the weather conditions, everything pointed to exceptional training and experience. Jake had flown with hundreds of pilots over the years, and he recognized the distinctive style that came from military aviation training. The lightning was getting closer now, and Jake could see Flight 447 adjusting its path to avoid the worst of the storm cells. The maneuvers were subtle but expertly executed, maintaining formation integrity while navigating around dangerous weather. Jake's respect for the commercial pilot continued to grow, even as his doubts about the mission intensified. Whatever else might be happening, they were dealing with a skilled professional who clearly cared about the safety of everyone involved. The radio crackled with another transmission from Flight 447, this time requesting permission to inform the passengers about the course change. It was another smart move, Jake realized, giving the crew an opportunity to prepare the cabin for potential emergency procedures without revealing the true nature of their situation. The pilot's tactical thinking was impressive, balancing the need for operational security with passenger safety in a way that demonstrated both experience and sound judgment. Jake's mind raced through possibilities as they continued toward Montana. If the intelligence was wrong, if Flight 447 was indeed innocent, then they were subjecting 180 innocent people to a terrifying ordeal that would traumatize them for life. But if the intelligence was correct, if there really were terrorists aboard, then any hesitation on his part could result in catastrophic consequences. The weight of command had never felt heavier. The storm system was directly ahead now, and Jake could see Flight 447 beginning to encounter moderate turbulence. The commercial aircraft handled the conditions with remarkable stability, its pilots making constant minor adjustments to maintain smooth flight. Jake found himself admiring their technique, recognizing the kind of precise control that came from years of experience and exceptional training. These were not the actions of desperate terrorists, but of skilled professionals doing their job under extraordinary circumstances. As they approached the leading edge of the storm system, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He was going to get a closer look at the cockpit of Flight 447, regulations be damned. Something about this entire situation felt wrong, and he owed it to everyone involved to investigate further. If there was even a chance that they were intercepting an innocent aircraft, he had to know for certain. The lives of 180 people hung in the balance, and Jake Harrison was not about to let them down. Rebecca could feel the tension in the cockpit growing thicker with each passing minute. The F-16s maintained their escort positions with military precision, but she could sense the pilots' uncertainty through their radio communications. The lead pilot's voice had carried a note of questioning that gave her hope. If she could somehow establish her credibility with the fighter pilots, maybe she could convince them that Flight 447 posed no threat to anyone. The turbulence from the approaching storm system provided an unexpected opportunity. As Flight 447 bucked and rolled through the increasingly rough air, Rebecca's military training took over. She flew the aircraft with the smooth precision that had made her one of the Air Force's top pilots 20 years ago. Every control input was measured and deliberate, maintaining formation integrity despite the challenging conditions. She hoped the fighter pilots would recognize the skill level they were witnessing. Daniel was handling the passenger communications with admirable calm, informing them about the course change and advising them to remain seated due to turbulence. His voice carried just the right amount of authority to maintain order without creating panic. Rebecca was grateful for his professionalism under pressure. They made a good team, and she knew that their combined experience gave them the best chance of resolving this crisis safely. The radio crackled with a transmission from air traffic control, providing updated weather information and routing instructions. Rebecca acknowledged the transmission with crisp military precision, using the formal communication protocols she'd learned during her Air Force career. It was a calculated risk, but she hoped the fighter pilots would recognize the distinctive style and realize they were dealing with a fellow service member. As they flew deeper into the storm system, Rebecca caught glimpses of the lead F-16 through the turbulent air. The fighter had moved closer than standard intercept distance, and she could see the pilot's helmet clearly through the cockpit canopy. Something about the aircraft's configuration seemed familiar, triggering memories from her time at Nellis Air Force Base. The squadron markings were partially visible, and Rebecca felt a surge of recognition. She had served with the 64th Aggressor Squadron at Nellis from 2003 to 2005, flying simulated enemy aircraft in training exercises. The F-16 formations, the communication protocols, even the tactical positioning, everything about this intercept reminded her of the countless training missions she'd flown over the Nevada desert. If the pilots surrounding her were from Nellis, there was a chance one of them might remember her from their shared service. The thought sparked an idea that was both desperate and brilliant. Rebecca reached up to her flight bag and pulled out her old Air Force flight suit, which she always carried as a good luck charm. Pinned to the chest was her mission patch from the 64th Aggressor Squadron, a distinctive design that would be instantly recognizable to any pilot who had served at Nellis. If she could somehow display the patch where the F-16 pilots could see it, it might be enough to establish her credibility. Working quickly but carefully, Rebecca attached the patch to the outside of her airline captain's jacket, positioning it where it would be visible through the cockpit window. The patch featured a stylized eagle with the squadron's motto, "Aggressors," emblazoned below it. Any pilot who had trained at Nellie's would recognize the design immediately and hopefully understand that they were dealing with a fellow warrior, not a terrorist. The lead F-16 was maintaining position off their starboard wing, close enough that Rebecca could see the pilot's movements clearly. She adjusted her position in the captain's seat, making sure the squadron patch was visible through the side window. The gesture felt almost childish, like a desperate attempt to prove her identity to someone who might not even be looking. But with 180 lives at stake, she was willing to try anything. Lightning flashed around them as they penetrated deeper into the storm system. The turbulence was becoming more severe, and Rebecca had to use all her skill to maintain stable flight. The F-16s were handling the conditions well, their pilots demonstrating the kind of precision flying that came from years of training and experience. Rebecca found herself impressed by their professionalism, even as she hoped to convince them of her innocence. The radio crackled with a transmission from the lead F-16 pilot, requesting Flight 447's current passenger manifest and crew information. Rebecca provided the details with military precision, including her own background as a former Air Force pilot. It was a calculated revelation, and she watched the fighter aircraft closely for any reaction. The pilot's response was noncommittal, but Rebecca thought she detected a subtle change in tone. As they continued through the storm, Rebecca caught sight of the lead pilot adjusting his position to get a better view of Flight 447's cockpit. The F-16 moved closer than standard intercept distance, and Rebecca could see the pilot's helmet turning toward her position. This was her moment. She shifted in her seat, making sure the squadron patch was clearly visible, and waited for some sign of recognition. The seconds stretched into eternity as Rebecca maintained her position, hopping against hope that the fighter pilot would notice the patch and understand its significance. The 64th Aggressor Squadron had trained thousands of pilots over the years, and the distinctive patch was like a badge of honor among those who had served. If this pilot was from Nellie's, if he had any connection to the squadron, he would know exactly what that patch represented. The radio remained silent except for routine position reports and weather updates. Rebecca began to wonder if her desperate gambit had failed, if the pilot hadn't seen the patch or didn't recognize its significance. But then she noticed the lead F-16 beginning to adjust its position again, moving even closer to get a better look. The pilot's helmet was turned directly toward her now, and Rebecca could almost feel the intensity of his scrutiny. Time seemed to slow as Rebecca waited for some response, some sign that her message had been received and understood. The storm raged around them, lightning illuminating the night sky in brilliant flashes that revealed the deadly ballet of aircraft flying in close formation. The F-16s maintained their escort positions with unwavering precision, ready to respond to any hostile action. But Rebecca sensed a change in the atmosphere. The tension was still there, but it felt different now, more questioning than threatening. The lead pilot's voice finally crackled through the radio, but his words were directed to his wingman rather than Flight 447. 2. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Check out the cockpit of the commercial bird, starboard side. Rebecca's heart pounded as she realized the pilot had spotted her squadron patch. Now she could only wait to see if he would recognize its significance and understand the message she was trying to send. The response came from the wingman, Captain Sarah Chen, whose voice carried a note of surprise. "Lead, I see it. That's a 64th Aggressor Squadron patch. What's a commercial pilot doing with Air Force Squadron insignia?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Rebecca knew this was her chance to explain her background and hopefully establish her credibility with the fighter pilots who held her fate in their hands. Rebecca keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Viper 1, this is Flight 447. I served with the 64th Aggressor Squadron from 2003 to 2005. Captain Rebecca Martinez, call sign Razor. I flew F-16s and A-10s before transitioning to commercial aviation. You can verify my service record through military personnel databases." The transmission was brief, but loaded with information that any Air Force pilot would understand. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Rebecca could imagine the fighter pilots processing this new information, trying to reconcile the image of a potential terrorist with that of a former Air Force officer. The squadron patch was more than just a piece of cloth. It was a symbol of service, sacrifice, and shared experiences that bound military aviators together across time and distance. Finally, the lead pilot's voice crackled through the radio again, but this time the tone was markedly different. "Flight 447, this is Lieutenant Colonel Jake Harrison, call sign Viper. I took over the 64th Aggressor Squadron in 2006. Stand by while I verify your information." Rebecca's heart leaped with hope. If this pilot had commanded her old squadron, he would have access to personnel records and might even remember her from reputation or shared acquaintances. The next few minutes would determine whether her desperate gambit had worked. Rebecca maintained her position, flying through the turbulent storm with the steady precision that had made her one of the Air Force's top pilots. The F-16s continued their escort, but she could sense a change in their posture. The threatening presence was still there, but it felt more protective now, as if the fighter pilots were beginning to see her as a fellow warrior rather than a potential enemy. The radio crackled with activity as Lieutenant Colonel Harrison communicated with ground control, requesting verification of Rebecca's service record. The process would take time, but Rebecca felt a surge of hope. If her identity could be confirmed, if the fighter pilots could be convinced that she was indeed a former Air Force officer, then maybe they could resolve this crisis without further incident. The lives of 180 innocent passengers hung in the balance, and Rebecca was willing to do whatever it took to get them home safely. As they flew through the storm-tossed sky, surrounded by armed fighter aircraft, Rebecca reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 20 years ago, she had been flying similar missions, intercepting suspected threats and protecting American airspace. Now she found herself on the other side of the equation, trying to prove her innocence to pilots who were simply doing their job. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she also understood the gravity of the situation and the weight of responsibility that came with command decisions. The squadron patch had been her lifeline, a tangible connection to her military past that might just save her civilian future. As she waited for verification of her service record, Rebecca continued to fly with the precision and professionalism that had defined her career. Whatever the outcome, she was determined to prove that Captain Rebecca Martinez, former Air Force pilot and current commercial aviator, was worthy of the trust placed in her by everyone aboard Flight 447. Lieutenant Colonel Jake Harrison's mind raced as he processed the information he'd just received. The name Rebecca Martinez was familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. The 64th Aggressor Squadron had a long and distinguished history, and many exceptional pilots had served with the unit over the years. If this commercial pilot was indeed a former squadron member, it would completely change the dynamics of the current situation. Jake's radio crackled with a transmission from NORAD control, acknowledging his request for personnel verification. The process would take several minutes, during which time the intercept would continue as planned. Jake found himself hoping that the verification would confirm Flight 447's pilot as a former Air Force officer. It would make the situation more complex from a tactical standpoint, but it would also provide a level of trust that was currently missing from the equation. As they flew through the increasingly turbulent weather, Jake studied the commercial aircraft's handling characteristics more closely. The pilot, possibly former Captain Martinez, was demonstrating exceptional skill in maintaining formation despite the challenging conditions. The aircraft responded to control inputs with the kind of precision that came from years of experience and superior training. Jake had flown with enough pilots to recognize genuine expertise when he saw it. The radio crackled with a transmission from Captain Sarah Chen, who was maintaining position off Flight 447's port wing. "Lead, I'm seeing some pretty impressive flying here. This pilot knows what they're doing." The formation discipline is textbook perfect, and the weather handling is exceptional. If this is a hijacking, the terrorists found themselves one hell of a pilot. Jake nodded grimly, sharing his wingman's assessment of the situation. The storm system was reaching its peak intensity, with lightning flashing constantly around them and turbulence that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. Jake watched as Flight 447 adjusted its course with smooth precision, avoiding the worst of the weather while maintaining perfect formation with the escort aircraft. The commercial pilot's technique was flawless, demonstrating the kind of situational awareness and tactical thinking that came from military training. Jake's radio crackled with an incoming transmission from ground control. The personnel verification was taking longer than expected, but preliminary records indicated that a Rebecca Martinez had indeed served with the 64th Aggressor Squadron during the specified time frame. The information was being cross-referenced with current commercial pilot databases to confirm the identity. Jake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as he processed this update. If Flight 447's pilot was indeed a former Air Force officer, it would raise serious questions about the intelligence that had triggered this intercept. Military pilots underwent extensive background checks and psychological evaluations. The idea that a former Air Force captain would turn terrorist was not impossible, but it was highly unlikely. Jake found himself hoping that the verification would provide clarity and potentially resolve the situation without further escalation. The radio crackled with another transmission from Flight 447, this time from the co-pilot. Viper formation. This is Flight 447's first officer. We're encountering severe turbulence and would like to request a slight altitude adjustment to improve passenger comfort. We're fully cooperating with your instructions and appreciate your professionalism in this situation. The request was reasonable and delivered with the kind of calm authority that Jake associated with experienced commercial aviators. Jake approved the altitude adjustment, noting how smoothly Flight 447 executed the maneuver despite the challenging conditions. The aircraft climbed through the turbulent air with steady precision, its pilots making constant minor adjustments to maintain optimal flight characteristics. Jake found himself impressed by the crew's professionalism and skill, qualities that seemed inconsistent with the terrorist threat they were supposedly investigating. The verification process was taking longer than Jake had hoped, but he understood the complexity of cross-referencing military and civilian records. In the meantime, he continued to study Flight 447's behavior, looking for any signs of deception or hostile intent. What he saw was a skilled crew managing a difficult situation with exemplary professionalism, maintaining passenger safety while cooperating fully with military instructions. Jake's radio crackled with a transmission from his squadron commander back at Nellis Air Force Base. The colonel was monitoring the situation closely and wanted regular updates on Flight 447 status. Jake provided a brief summary of the intercept, including the pilot's claim of former military service and the ongoing verification process. The commander's response was non-committal, but carried a note of concern about the potential diplomatic implications if the intelligence proved incorrect. The storm system was beginning to weaken slightly, but they were still flying through significant turbulence and lightning activity. Jake watched as Flight 447's pilots adjusted their course to avoid the worst of the weather, demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking and situational awareness that came from years of experience. The commercial aircraft handled the conditions with remarkable stability, a testament to both the crew's skill and the aircraft's capabilities. Jake's radio crackled with an update from ground control. The personnel verification was nearly complete, but there were some discrepancies in the records that required additional investigation. The name Rebecca Martinez did appear in Air Force databases, but there were questions about dates of service and squadron assignments that needed clarification. Jake felt his frustration growing as the verification process dragged on, but he understood the importance of being thorough. As they continued through the turbulent night sky, Jake found himself thinking about the human cost of this intercept. If Flight 447 was indeed innocent, then 180 people were being subjected to a terrifying ordeal that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The passengers were probably beginning to realize that something was seriously wrong, despite the crew's best efforts to maintain calm. Jake carried the weight of that responsibility heavily, knowing that his decisions could affect hundreds of lives. The radio crackled with another transmission from Flight 447, this time with updated passenger information. The commercial pilot reported that several passengers were becoming anxious about the course change and weather conditions, but the cabin crew was managing the situation effectively. The professionalism and calm authority in the pilot's voice continued to impress Jake, adding to his growing doubts about the intelligence they'd received. Jake's wingman, Captain Sarah Chen, moved into closer formation to get a better view of Flight 447's cockpit. She reported seeing the pilot clearly through the side window, noting the squadron patch and the professional demeanor of the crew. Sarah's assessment confirmed Jake's own observations about the high skill level and military bearing of the commercial pilots. The evidence was mounting that they might be dealing with innocent civilians rather than terrorists. The verification process finally produced results, and Jake's radio crackled with a transmission from ground control that would change everything. The personnel records confirmed that Rebecca Martinez had indeed served with the 64th Aggressor Squadron from 2003 to 2005, achieving the rank of captain before transitioning to commercial aviation. Her service record was exemplary, with no disciplinary actions or security concerns. The information painted a picture of a dedicated professional who had served her country with distinction. Jake felt a surge of relief mixed with concern as he processed this information. If Flight 447's pilot was indeed former Captain Martinez, then the intelligence that had triggered this intercept was likely flawed. The implications were staggering, both for the immediate situation and for the broader intelligence community. Jake knew he had to act quickly to prevent further escalation while ensuring the safety of everyone involved. The radio crackled with Jake's voice as he prepared to make the most important transmission of his career. Flight 447, this is Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. Your military service has been verified. Captain Rebecca Martinez, 64th Aggressor Squadron, 2003 to 2005. Your record shows exemplary service and an honorable discharge. I need you to understand that we're operating on intelligence that may be flawed, but we have to follow protocols. Can you give me your word as a former Air Force officer that your aircraft poses no threat? The question hung in the air like a challenge. One former military pilot to another. Rebecca's response came immediately, her voice carrying the authority and conviction of someone who had sworn an oath to defend her country. Colonel Harrison, you have my word as a former Air Force officer and current commercial pilot that Flight 447 poses no threat to anyone. We are carrying 180 innocent passengers who just want to get home safely. I understand your position and the protocols you're following. I've been in your shoes, and I know the weight of command responsibility. Whatever intelligence you received, I can assure you that this aircraft is clean. The transmission resonated with Jake on multiple levels. The voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded respect in the military, someone who understood the burden of leadership and the importance of honor. Jake found himself believing every word, recognizing in Rebecca Martinez a kindred spirit who had faced similar challenges and responsibilities during her military career. Jake's radio crackled with a transmission to his wingman and the other escort aircraft. Formation. This is lead. We have verified that Flight 447's pilot is former Captain Rebecca Martinez, 64th Aggressor Squadron. Her service record is exemplary, and I believe we may be dealing with flawed intelligence. Continue escort procedures, but I'm recommending to command that we reassess the threat level. The transmission marked a turning point in the intercept, acknowledging the possibility that they had been chasing shadows rather than genuine threats. The storm system was finally beginning to clear, and Jake could see stars appearing through breaks in the clouds. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. Perhaps the confusion and uncertainty of this night were also beginning to clear, revealing the truth that had been obscured by faulty intelligence and bureaucratic procedures. As they flew through the clearing sky, surrounded by the aftermath of the storm, Jake prepared for what he hoped would be a peaceful resolution to this unprecedented crisis. The radio crackled with updated instructions from NORAD control, acknowledging the new information about Flight 447's pilot and ordering a reassessment of the threat level. The intercept would continue pending further investigation.